Welcome to this topic in critical reading and response, and that is the methods of interpretation. Methods of interpretation. Um, so it's very important for us to note that um, works of art have to be interpreted for audiences to appreciate the aesthetic value of literature. Um, Literature is a form of expression, and it is the way writers um, express their ideas. And they don't just express the ideas directly, like maybe journalistic writing or academic writing. In literary writing, a writer um, will look for a style to express the message, and that is why as a reader of literature, you need critical reading to unravel the concealed messages in the text. So, what is interpretation? Therefore, is reading ideas as well as sentences. Um, you don't just read sentences to get the meaning, but you go deeper, to bring out the ideas, behind these particular sentences. So we need to be aware of the cultural and historical context in which the text is based. Yeah. Yeah. When a writer writes a work, there are those debates surrounding the work, the context, the cultural and historical context of the work. And it's important for you as a reader to incorporate this context in expression of meaning, in expression of meaning. For example, in Ngugi's writing, The River Between, there were so many debates from Aimé Césaire about cultural essentialism, return to past cultures, and then there was Fanon, who was talking about the need for the two cultures, that's Western and African, to stand side by side. So as the writer writes this particular book, is incorporating the historical context and the post-colonial context of that time. That's why post-colonial ideas by Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire are very crucial to the understanding or interpretation of the river between. And that is why, in interpretation, you need a reader, has to make, his or her mark, has to bring out his perspective on a work of art. So interpretation is not just reading, but it's the ability to bring out a certain perspective of a work of art. It can be a post-colonial perspective. It can be a Marxist perspective. It can be a psychoanalytic perspective. It can be a feminist perspective. It can be a post-colonial feminist perspective. It can be a magical realism perspective. It can be, a moral kind of perspective. So in interpretation, we are not just interested in interpreting the sentences, but to bring out a certain perspective that is derived from the cultural and historical context of the work of art. So the intellectual context is very important, and what debates, was the author trying to contribute? For example, if you look at God Dies by the Nile, there is that psychoanalytic perspective, and there's also a feminist perspective, and also at that time, Marxism was very rife, and so Nawal El-Saadawi is interested in bringing out these three perspectives. For example, as an author who is a psychiatrist, he had to bring out the psychoanalytic aspect in how the id contributes, to the patriarchal oppression of women, that the id is actually stronger in men. That's what he suggests. For example, if you look at also this book, Black Rain, yeah, by Masuji, Black Rain. The debate at that time was the effect of the atomic bomb, the effect of the atomic bomb or effect of nuclear weapons. And because it happened, the novel is written basing on the atomic bomb, the bombing of Hiroshima, in 1945. It must be 1945. 1945. We cannot ignore the historical context of our work during interpretation. So the first method of interpretation is analysis. What is analysis? Yeah, analysis is concerned with the patterns of a text. Yeah, you break down the content of a text into individual parts and then try to gauge the patterns that are brought out in a text. For example, the behavior of characters in the river and the source. You look at characterization, and try to focus on certain patterns of behavior of characters in the river and the source or in blossoms of the savannah. Why is it that mostly the male characters are presented as either robbers, are presented as oppressive, lazy, and foolish in blossoms of savannah? Why is it that Ole Kulet, we see tries to show or to associate male characters with some negative traits? Why is that female characters in blossoms of savannah are portrayed as victims of circumstances, as weak, and most of them are basically innocent. But the men are seen as oppressors. Oloisidori, we see Oloisidori also being a bank robber, Oloisidori being very immoral, you see. Then we find Olekailo being very foolish. He cannot even have feel it when he loses his daughters. And then we find Pamwat, who is the only positive character, dying early in the novel, just like the character Owor Kembo in The River and the Source, the only positive character, dies very early in the novel. Good characters, like Wang Sino in The River and the Source, they do what? They just die by swallowing a piece of bone. And then we have, of course, negative characters such as Otieno Kembo living longer. Even in Onisigu's family, you see the boy child like Aoro is indisciplined, but Vera, basically Vera, the girls are very positive traits, and all that. Find Aoro not having, any effort to go for a PhD and study hard, but he's the wife one day who is interested in PhD in medicine and achieves more. So why are these patterns? And by analyzing these patterns now, we are able, to see the themes coming out. The theme of feminism, especially Western feminism, comes out very strongly by analyzing character. And also by looking at the techniques, you look at the stylistic devices. Why is it that sometimes Ngugi uses very long sentences in petals of blood? Yeah. Why is it that sometimes Mook uses very long sentences in petals of blood? Why is it that also characters who are well educated in Betraying the City speak in standard English, but characters with poor education, such as Mulili, speak broken English? So through these particular techniques, we are able to get the message and the overall theory, the overall argument in Blossoms of Savannah. It is basically about radical feminism. The writer is trying to bolster the position of women by fighting patriarchies. The overall thesis comes out. So analysis plays a very important role in literature. Then explication. Now, explication is a method of interpretation in which the reader tries to get the deeper meaning of a work of art. The reader moves from the explicit to implied meanings, moves from denotative to connotative meanings. Yeah. So explication is not just mere paraphrasing or restatement, but it is a word. It's an attempt of the reader to unravel or unfold deeper meanings in works of art. So a critical reader explains its syntax, lexical meaning, allusions, and the linguistic choices of writers. For example, look at the poem The Town Beauty, the poem The Town Beauty. Yeah. Why is the body described as base and worthless? If indeed this woman was struck by a spear, does a spear, an ordinary spear, make the body of the girl to become base? Yeah. And the meaning of the word base means defiled. So if her body was defiled and worthless, then we suggest that this particular spear may not be an ordinary spear. Then of course, the narrator or the person then says that the face was crossed or it was fires as if hours ago, not lovely to touch. That when you look at the corpse of this girl, the face was what? Fires as if hours ago, not lovely to touch. So this means that there is somebody who had just touched this body a few hours ago. And the touch in this sense may not necessarily be an ordinary touch, especially now that the body is defiled. This touch would be a fondle rather than a normal touch. Then the women that were there, were frightened. Why are the women frightened? But the men fumed with fury. Yeah. So the men are furious because they don't want, some people to come here and defile the girls. And the women are frightened because they are potential victims of heterosexual rape. Yeah. So you can see at the end of the day, you discover that this poem is not just talking about a girl who was butchered, yeah, but it's talking about a girl who was raped. So we are moving from the surface meaning of an ordinary murder to rape because of what? Ability to unravel deeper meanings. Ability to unravel deeper meanings. We also have poems such as the African thunderstorm, that the wind as the wind howls by, the trees bend to let it pass, and then flags wave like tattered clothes of the women wave like tattered flags. Why are the clothes waving like tattered flags? A tattered flag, a torn flag is a symbol of loss of independence. So immediately, the image of the tattered flag gives the poem a political meaning. And so from the west, the wind moving from the west, therefore, takes us, to a deeper meaning that these are colonial powers who are moving from Western countries into Africa, and the women who are moving around with clothes exposing their nakedness, they just represent Africa and how it was exploited by the West, how Africa was exploited. So the women are African countries were exploited by Western colonialists. And then we have children, children who are innocently running around. South African people who are very innocent, who are very ignorant of the foreigners who had hidden plans to exploit and take everything from them and all that. So at the end of the day, the poem The African Thunderstorm is not just talking about an African rain, but it's rather talking about the advent of colonialism and the eventual exploitation of Africa. Of course, we have poems like The Weaver Bird that are actually extended metaphors. They have deeper meanings. Of course, we are talking about The Weaver Bird by Kofi Awonor. The Weaver Bird by Kofi Awonor. We have also have poems like The Splash, yeah, by Yusuf Kasam. The Splash by Yusuf Kasam. That the stone lands on the pond, which is calm, and then we have ripples moving across or moving in the pond, and then of course after ripples, the stone moves and clings at the bottom. After some time, the pond calms, and then the pond is surrounded by green flowers, by purple flowers, by yellow flowers, and all that. That is a poem. Is just talking about a stone on the pond, but it has a deeper meaning. It will be both political and social. But at a political level, so the African continent, which was very peaceful, and then you see there was colonialism, which brought a lot of violence, disruption of cultural life, the psychological effect of colonialism on the African people. And then after some time, of course, there was armed struggle, which caused more violence. And then after that, the colonialists, returned to their home. But you see what they caused in Africa, the effects remain, and that is symbolized by the stone at the bottom of the pond. And you see, so this is explication that is very common in excerpt metaphors or allegories like Animal Farm. Because there's one of my books which I've just published, The Rise of Rotterdam. The Rise of Rotterdam is actually an allegory about the rise of Africa. That Rotterdam is a kingdom of rodents. Rodents, as juxtaposed to cats, that represent Western powers, colonial powers. It shows the predator relationship between Africa and the West. So the novel will come, and we will see how it goes. So Zeregel, 1969, Evers, that in reading a literary work, that is a work that gives aesthetic pleasure, the student cannot stop with the explicit meaning. If we remain at the surface meaning, we cannot enjoy certain literary works. Then the last method of interpretation is evaluation. So what is evaluation? This is how well a text does. It is the value of the text. When you read a text, what value does it contribute? Which values does it contribute? Or what addition does it make to the world of literature? Are there any canons that the work contributes to? Are there any specific stylistic devices that the work contributes to? Yeah, when we are considering it intellectually, what is the cognitive value? Yeah, does the book bring? Yeah, are there any specific styles that it brings? What does it contribute to the theory? How does it contribute to the discipline, or how does it contribute to a literary theory? Yeah, does the evidence and reasoning adequately support the theory? For example, when you look at Blossoms of Savannah versus radical feminism, it is an element of stereotyping of male characters, and that weakens the value of Blossoms of Savannah. The same way to even The River and the Source, yeah, where male characters are deliberately killed in advance. It's so mechanically done. Even when you look at The God Dies by the Nile, when you look at the feminism in it, yeah, male characters in that book, there are those who commit necromancy. Yeah, most of them are immoral, and there's not even a single male character who is upright. So the element of gender stereotyping waters down the feministic, canon in some of these novels. But when you look at psychoanalytic interpretation, I think, God Dies by the Nile ranks very high because we see the role of the super ego and the ego. We see phallocentric symbols standing out very, very clearly, and the value of that book, as regards psychoanalysis, is actually very, very high, and the arguments are very consistent. But when it comes to radical feminism, most of the arguments are not very convincing. They are exaggerated and mechanically done. Um, so when you look at, for example, the beautiful ones are not yet born. The beautiful ones are not yet born. The writer uses lexical deviation in a very special way to paint the moral corruption in Ghana. So lexical deviation stands out as a great style in the beautiful ones are not yet born. There is also the allegory of the cave, the allegory of the cave set by Plato. That allusion comes out very, very strongly in The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. That some people have said The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born is an the African novel, Come of Age, the African novel, Come of Age. What is the practical and moral value of the book? What is the aesthetic value of the book? So we look at also the moral aspects of the text, the moral aspects of the text. Look at The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. Look at the marginalization of Black characters or black or non-white characters like Shylock and the Prince of Morocco. Yeah, there's an element of racism that comes out very strongly in The Merchant of Venice and even Othello, a black character who is so marginalized. And because of his blackness, it's like the writer suggests that, the white society is very intelligent and it can easily make mincemeat of the Moors or of the blacks. So the morality of these two texts, is brought to question, is brought to question. Like now, even in the era of, same-sex relationships and heterosexual relationships, the moral of the text can determine whether it can be published or not. The policy of the publishing house will determine whether a novel with the same-sex relationships or heterosexual relationships will be published or rejected. And so evaluation is a very, very important area. And this one is basically common, among editors. They evaluate manuscript to determine whether they should be rejected or accepted. So the practical value of a text is what we call evaluation. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you.